Finances. You all have to pay for college, and you all have to pay for your expenses while you're in college. So it's important to really think about how you allocate your finances so that you can afford to be a student and you can think about your future in terms of retirement, salary, savings, etc. I think a lot of us spend money on things we don't need. We're constantly bombarded by advertisements telling us that we can't be happy unless we have the latest gadget or the newest clothing line or this particular brand. And what happens is we end up spending money that we could be saving to make ourselves more calm in our retirement, or to help pay back our student loans, or to avoid debt, or have more freedom to choose careers that may not pay quite as much but are very fulfilling to us. So this is why I want to talk about finances for college, both so you can just make sure that you can pay the rent and pay for your food, but also so you have the peace of mind to know you can make decisions not just based on money, but based on what is meaningful to you. You're going to want to have available the handout 30 tips for money saving. I'm going to have you do a little reflection on where your money goes and where your money might need to go, and see if those two things align. So get out a piece of paper, and after I go through the prompt, pause the video and write these things down. So first, you're going to jot down money you've spent over the last week on things you didn't need to spend money on. So obviously you need to pay your rent, you need to pay for utilities, you need to pay for food, transportation, healthcare. But you probably didn't need that lunch at McDonald's, or you probably didn't need that brand new pair of shoes or that coffee from Starbucks. So think about those things that you could have maybe saved your money from. Then I want you to jot down an emergency situation in which you would need some savings to cover the costs. So if your car breaks down, or if you get in a car accident, if you have damage to your home and you need to pay for repairs, maybe you even have a lawsuit against you and you have to get a lawyer and pay for that lawyer. Those are large chunks of money that you would need a savings backlog in order to cover. Now, I want you to think about how you're planning to pay off your student loans. Write down your plan for paying off your student loans if you are getting student loans. Many of you won't know exactly how much they'll end up being, but if you are planning on taking out student loans, it is going to be a significant amount of money per month. So I want you to think about, well, how am I going to make that work? It's going to be an added cost past your normal expenses. Where exactly are you going to be able to take the money and add to that? And your first job often isn't that high paying of a job. So how are you going to cover the cost of these student loans when they start demanding it 6 months after you graduate? So hopefully by reflecting on the way you spend your money, you got a sense of where some of your money goes, and some, a little bit of mindfulness about what you might need money for. And perhaps you can make some adjustments. Maybe you don't need to buy McDonald's every day for lunch. Maybe you could bring your own lunch, and you could put that into a savings account in case you have an emergency. Or when it's time to pay off your student loans, maybe you'll have some money saved up to start paying them off. And it's easy to make small changes that'll allow you to have kind of a cushion for when things go wrong, and will also allow you to save for things that you need to spend money on later in the future, like when you have to pay back your student loans about 6 months after you graduate. So now what I'd like you to do is to watch these two videos. They are linked in Canvas, and write down tips that you find interesting or helpful for you. And these are going to be focused on budgeting for students and then loan repayment for students. So hopefully it was helpful to watch those videos. It gave you a nice overview of how to budget and a really nice overview of the loan situation when you're a student. So it is important that you want to, if you're taking out student loans, try and take out federal loans. This is because private loans are at a much higher interest rate. We learned a little bit about that when we talked about financial aid, but it'll help you a lot later because you have to pay to have borrowed that money. And the longer you're paying off your student loans, the more money you're going to pay to have that privilege of having taken that loan. So attempting to make sure that you initially take federal loans with a low interest rate, and then you pay off as much as you possibly can each month is going to help it so it actually costs you a lot less over the life of the loan. For example, when I graduated from my master's program, I had over $30,000 in debt, close to $40,000, and I paid about double what the monthly requirement was, and therefore it cost me a whole lot less by the end of the time I got the loan paid off. And so that's something I would recommend you do. If you have the wiggle room, pay more than what is required, because then you're going to break down the principal, which is the initial loan amount, versus just paying interest, and it'll make it cost you a lot less over time. Now I'm going to have you take out that handout, 30 money saving tips, and you're going to go ahead and pause the video and read it. I'd like you to circle 3 tips you think you can use and that you think would have the maximum impact on your budget. And maybe you could think about how by using these tips you might take that money and potentially eventually apply it to student loans or save it for later. So we talked about budgeting through the video that you watched. I'm going to provide you some information about budgeting apps that you may choose to use. You have a budgeting assignment for this class that uses Excel, and you can actually use this budgeting Excel spreadsheet for yourself, or you can create one on your own if you prefer to have sort of more of a paper-based budget. But there are a lot of apps out there that can help you with your budgeting. A very popular one is called Mint. And Mint allows you to track your spending as well as create a budget for your spending. It will require that it gets linked to all your bank accounts and your bill accounts. So when you pay your mortgage, if it's on an online account, it would connect to that and it would say, oh, you need to pay your mortgage. It has reminders and things like that. And then it tracks your spending. But it's nice to help you get an idea of where your money's going and then also control what the budget is, and it gives you sort of a bar of how close you are getting to your budget amount each month. Acorns and Pocket Guard are very similar. They're just alternatives to Mint. You Need a Budget is a zero-based budgeting model. So what this means is you set up the budget where all the money is allocated and all the money is going to go to those places. So it doesn't say, oh, you have a little bit left over. The idea is that you allocate every cent of your incoming money to specific purposes: savings, your rent, food, personal care, things like that. And this is really nice because then you know where all your money is going, but it's a little less flexible than something like Mint. And finally, Personal Capital. Personal Capital was originally designed as an app for tracking your investments, but it also has a budgeting component to it. A lot of people really like this if they're saving for retirement and putting money into investments for retirement, which you should all hopefully be doing already, but if not, you're thinking about doing that. And it has a lot of really great features to help you with that piece, to watch the market and watch how your money grows while also watching your budget. I wanted to give you a link to this financial aid loan calculator because this is a very helpful tool for you to figure out how much the loan would eventually cost you if you paid a little bit extra every month based on interest rates and how long it's going to take you, what the loan term is. So it's a really good thing to have in your back pocket to play around with, and you can actually use this loan calculator for other things besides your financial aid and school loans. So here are some recommended percentages for budgeting, and these are just guidelines. Budgeting is very individual and specific per person, but these are some overall recommendations of how your money should be allocated. They say about 35% of your money should be allocated to housing. So, if you sit down and look at your income and calculate that out, it may or may not be reasonable depending on where you live. However, if you are going way above that 35%, you may want to consider something like maybe getting a roommate or looking for a cheaper place. Transportation is about 15 to 20%. This could be less if you tend to take public transportation. It could be more if you have a brand new car, but the recommendation is about 15 to 20% for transportation. 10 to 20% for food. Debt payments, if you have credit card debt or other loans, this doesn't include a mortgage, that would fall under housing, but debt payments should be about 5 to 15%. Personal and discretionary, this is, fun things, or if you need, cosmetics or clothing. Clothing has its own section, but other things that are just items that you buy for yourself or something to go out and have fun. That's about 5 to 10% of your income. Savings is about 5 to 10% of your income, and I recommend going over to the 10% because it is important that you're saving money in case an emergency happens or you eventually want to retire. Clothing is about 3 to 5%, and medical is about 3%. This could be higher for some people, or could even be free for you if you're under 26 and you're on your parents' health insurance. Sometimes we need a little bit of a reality check in terms of our lifestyle, where we live, in terms of how much we need to make to cover that lifestyle. There is a program on California Career Zone called Choose Your Lifestyle, where you can actually play around with the kind of lifestyle you would love to live in a certain city in California, and they'll give you an estimate of how much money you would need to make to cover that lifestyle. It is an estimate, and they don't update it every year with the cost of living, so it may be a little lower or maybe a little higher, but usually a little lower than what the actual cost of living is, but it allows you to actually change the number if you know how much things cost in your area. But overall, it gives you some pretty good ballparks. So basically what you'll do is you'll have an opportunity to choose, okay, what kind of housing am I going to live in? Am I going to own a home? Do I live in a rental? Is it with roommates? Do I live at home? And then you choose that, and then it'll ask you, what kind of transportation do you use? Do you use public transportation? Do you own your car? Or do you have a loan for a high-end car, et cetera, et cetera? It'll ask you how much you want to go out to eat, how much you want to stay in to eat, how often you're going to go to concerts and other entertainment. And then it will give you a number at the end and a link to jobs that make about that amount of money. So this is something that you should really do and kind of get a sense of how much it really costs to be on your own. And you may want to err on the side of caution and add a little bit into the estimates that they put in to the actual program. So go ahead and click on the link in Canvas and go and play with it and see where you end up. That coffee that you buy for yourself, or those little things that you buy and go, it's just $3 or it's just $5, can actually add up to quite a lot of money, especially if you consider if you actually took the money from the thing that you're spending money on, your Starbucks coffee, and put it into something where you get a return on your investment, if you get interest on it. So this chart actually shows you if you spend about $5 a day on a Starbucks coffee, which that can be modest for certain coffees, and that'll add up to about $150 a month. If you actually put it into accounts or the market, the stock market, mutual funds or things like that, at various rates of return, it's actually going to give you quite a lot of money. So over 10 years, if you get a 4% rate of return, you are going to have $22,161. That's a big chunk of change. You could buy a modest car with that. And would you really miss your coffee if you could buy a car cash? Over 30 years, I'm going to talk about the 8% rate of return, because over about 30 years, the average rate of return, if you put something into the market, is about 6 to 8%. So over 30 years, if you're putting that $5 a week in, $5 a day in, you're going to have $225,000. So that's almost $250,000 from this $5 a day that you're spending on your coffee. And you can go ahead and look at the other areas. If you get a little bit higher rate of return, or if you leave it in a little bit longer, it's a lot of money that you can make from doing this. So my suggestion is, take that money that you spend on little things. Maybe your vice is a coffee. Maybe you like the dollar bin at Target. Maybe you like to buy, more high-end cosmetics. And try and take that money and put it into savings. And it can really actually pay you back significantly. And will you really miss that coffee? Make it at home. It's much, much quicker and easier anyway. I also want to bring up loans. Many people will finance a car, meaning they'll get a loan, they won't actually buy the car cash. And people say, oh, well, the car's $20,000. And That's what it's going to cost me. But they forget that the interest rate actually adds up. So if you get a $20,000 car, which is a pretty modest car, with a 6% interest rate and pay it off over about 5 years, how much will the car end up costing you? What do you guys think? So the car is actually going to end up costing you $23,199. So you are spending an additional almost $3,200 on this car. So you always want to think about that when you're financing a car. My recommendation is to save up money and buy a car, through Craigslist or some other used car place, cash. Because what happens with a vehicle is the minute you drive it off the lot, it depreciates in value. So it's not like a home, which most of the time actually appreciates in value, except for when you have big housing crisis. But cars always lose their value. And so you're actually not just losing the money that you're putting in for the car and the interest, you're losing the value of the car on top of that. So when you sell it, it's even less money than you put into it. So the best thing to do is to try and buy a car cash with saved up money. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about savings and saving for the future. And this is more of a life success option, but it actually can relate really well to your college success, because if you know you have this nest egg for later when you retire, and that you're creating yourself and you're not relying on a pension or a 401k, which a pension is something where basically the employer pays you every month after you retire. So it's kind of like a mini salary, and a 401k is a employer-sponsored market-based retirement plan. If you're not relying on those things, or you know that you have a backup plan, you may have a little bit more freedom in terms of what you choose for your career or the employers that you consider. So I want to talk about these things because I don't think a lot of people talk about it, and I really wish someone talked to me about it when I was young. So if you take a look at this graph, you're going to see information about somebody, Emily, who started saving at 25 years old, and Dave, who started saving money at 35 years old. And you can see the horizontal lines will tell you how much money they actually put in. So at $50,000, if they initially put that in, you can see how that money grows quite a bit more for Emily than Dave. So what this graph shows you is that Emily started saving just 10 years earlier and put in only about 33% more money into her account than Dave put into his. So what happened with that is by the time they're both ready to retire, which on here is 65, the retirement age is actually 67, but when they're both ready to retire, Emily has almost twice as much money as Dave. She did not put in twice as much money. She only put in 33% more. But because she started 10 years earlier, her money compounded on itself. It's called compounding interest. And so the interest happens on the initial amount, and then that gains interest, and then the interest is on the initial amount plus the gained interest. And then that just keeps happening, and the interest is a percentage of the money that's there. So you end up with a lot more, because if you start earlier, it compounds more often. So what's happening here is Emily has $402,000 by the time she's retiring, and Dave only has $203,000. And that extra 10 years of compounding returns has made the situation for Emily much more comfortable and much more stable for retirement. Here's another way of looking at this. This graph shows you how much money you would need to save each month in order to get $1 million at retirement. And many financial experts are saying you need $1 million or even more to be able to retire comfortably around 65. So you want to remember that this may even go higher as you're reaching your retirement age. So you do need a significant amount of money in order to retire. You may also get retirement money from a pension, as I mentioned, or a 401k. But with a 401k, you still need to do some contributing usually, although your employer will contribute to that as well. But it's a good idea to have an alternative because things like pensions are starting to get more and more rare. Employers are contributing less and less to 401ks. So you want to make sure you're covering yourself as well. So this will show you how significant it is in terms of how the ability to save $1 million changes as you get older, if you start older, I mean. So if you start at 20, you only need to save $361 a month to have $1 million at a 65-year-old retirement. So that's not that much money. You know, if you don't have a job, it can be a little rough. But if you have a job, that's a reasonable amount of money to put in every month. If you start at 25, only 5 years later, it is $499 a month that you have to save to have $1 million at retirement. If you start at 35, which is when a lot of people start because they're more established in their career and they feel like they have the extra money, you have to put in $990 a month, so almost $1,000 a month in order to get to $1 million at retirement. Then if you look at the more scary ones, if you start at 50, you have to put in over $3,000 a month. I don't know a lot of people that have an extra $3,000 a month to put into savings. And God forbid, if you start at 60, you have to put $14,000 a month into your retirement, which I really don't know anybody that has that kind of money. So the moral of the story here is start saving now and keep saving and make sure you don't wait until you're 60. Here's another example of how powerful time is when you're investing your money. So take a quick look at this. You'll see under Ben Invest, he's investing $2,000 a year. It's not per month, don't worry. $2,000 a year since he was 19, and then he completely stops at 26. Versus Arthur, who invests nothing at all until he's 26, which is not that many years later, and then invests $2,000 a year until the retirement at 65. So you can see that if you add up all those 2000s, Arthur actually put in a lot more money. But if you look at the totals at the bottom, Ben just putting in $2,000 until he was 26 ends up with over $2 million. And Arthur, even though he put in a lot more money, he actually ends up with only $1.5 million by the time he's ready to retire. And this is because he didn't start as early. So this explains it a little bit more in detail. So at 19, Ben did $2,000 a year, which is not that much per month. And he had investment funds that averaged at a 12% interest rate. That's pretty high. The average is usually about 8%. So the ending numbers probably wouldn't be quite as high, but it's the same concept even if you only get 8%. So he put a total of $16,000 into his investment funds. Versus Arthur, who didn't start until 27, he actually ended up putting $78,000 in over 39 years. So his money, taking out of his paycheck, $78,000, ended up with less money, with about $500,000 less money, which is totally an amazing illustration of compounding interest. So again, start now, start early, and you really will reap the benefits. The advice I want to leave you with is as follows. Create a budget. Know where your money is going. Track your spending and see how much you need to allocate to certain things in your budget, and then stick to it. Really try and manage your spending. There are a lot of things that you probably buy that you do not need to buy, that you will, look at a month later and not care about it. So try and only buy what you need, and definitely only buy what you can afford. Do not get into the trap of credit cards. Credit cards can really become a huge problem. I've known several friends who've gotten into huge amounts of credit card debt, and it's very high interest rates, and it just gets out of hand quickly. So only buy what you actually have real money to buy. It's not a bad idea to use your credit card because it allows you to build credit for things later like buying a home, but use it like a debit card. Assume you have to pay it off every month. It's like a bill. It's not free money. Please don't get into that trap. Also, look at what you spend your money on. I think that a lot of us get lured in by advertising and think that we need something when we're actually perfectly fine with what we already have. There's some really great blogs about how to save money and how to retire early that talk about this philosophy of looking at items and thinking of them not only as the money that you have to spend to buy the item, but the money you're losing in savings and investment if you do buy the item. And, if you think about it, all of the things that we have, how many of them do you actually use and pay attention to regularly? I mean, I don't know about you, but I at least have a couple of kitchen items that I almost never use, and I spent money on them. I have a different philosophy now. I'm a little bit more of a minimalist. I only buy things that I 100% need, but for a long time I wasn't, and I have things that if I had put that money in investment, it would have made me money instead of me having this extra thing I have to cart around every time I have to move. Make a plan for paying back your student loans. So you'll have to add this into your future budget. You may even want to start saving money in order to pay back your student loans. And you want to think about this when you're making decisions about career options. Also, there are some ways to not take out as many student loans. We talked about grants and we talked about scholarships when we talked about financial aid. So that's free money if you can get a grant. Or if you can apply for scholarships, those are things you don't have to pay back later. And if there are things that won't cost you money because there's no interest on those things. There are other things you can do as well. You could have a part-time job that will help you pay for your cost of living while you're in school. You can get a roommate, you can do car sharing, you can use public transportation, lots of ways of keeping that cost down. Also, avoid debt. So I'm just going to say this again. Do not enter into getting credit card debt. Pay your credit card off every month. This is how you build a good credit score and how you avoid getting into that snowball of credit card debt. If you can avoid buying a car with a car loan, that's another good approach because it doesn't just cost you the cost of the car, it also costs you the cost of the loan. Also, save 10% of your salary. And you may not be making that much money right now, but you're going to want to try and save some money. You need it for now, for any kind of emergency that comes up. They say you need about 3 months salary in your savings for emergencies. If you lose your job or something horrible happens to your home, you have to replace the roof or something. And you also want to think about saving for retirement. When you save for retirement, I would recommend doing what are called no-load funds. So these are funds that do not have extra fees on them because that can actually cost you a lot of money once you're ready to retire, and have low cost index funds. So an index fund is something that is not managed by stock brokers actively. It basically follows the stock market indexes, things like the NASDAQ and the Dow Jones or the whole market. And they've actually shown that actively managed funds aren't any better performing than index funds. So these funds where you have somebody, going around changing the fund all the time, trying to beat the market, it generally doesn't beat the market. It actually sometimes underperforms these index funds that just follow the market. So you want to look for index funds because 1, they tend to do better, and 2, they are much lower cost. When you invest in funds in the stock market, do not invest in individual stocks as your primary retirement approach. Individual stocks are volatile because they are basically owning a piece of a company, and it's just this one company. So if this company does poorly, you've lost some money. So for example, if you invested in Blockbuster some years ago, you probably wouldn't be doing so well. You really want to make sure you diversify your portfolio, and that sounds, very fancy, but it basically just means invest in a lot of different things. And what happens with the market is they offer things called exchange traded funds or mutual funds that are already packaged as a diversified portfolio. When you buy a mutual fund or you buy an exchange traded fund, it already is a grouping of different companies so that it helps protect you. Also, you will want to make sure you open an account at an investment firm. A lot of people love Vanguard because it's employee owned and it tends to have very low cost mutual and exchange traded funds. But Fidelity is starting to compete with Vanguard a little bit. They actually have some funds that cost no money at all, which is brand new in the stock market. So that's something that would be interesting for you to look into. Other people might use some of the more online versions of this. There's a company called iShares. There is no physical brokerage. It's just all online. So that's another option. They're newer and less established and have less of a reputation, but they do have some excellent funds as well. Make sure that you get funds with an expense ratio of below 0.2%, ideally below 0.1%. So there are quite a few through Vanguard and Fidelity that are below 0.1%. So like 0.07 or 0.08. And this is because this percentage is what you're going to have to pay once you cash out on your mutual funds or your exchange traded funds. And when you're 65, that's a lot of money. Right now, 0.2% of what you're putting in doesn't seem like a lot, but when you have $1 million in the stock market later and you're ready to retire, that is a big chunk of change they're going to have to pay to the brokerage firm. So one that I'm going to just mention, and I'm not making any specific recommendations, right? The market goes up and down. I can't, I'm not an expert in this, but the one that I mentioned, the new Fidelity fund, FZROX, this is the free fund that they have. And you can get into it at a low cost because it is an exchange traded fund. So exchange traded funds and mutual funds are pretty close to being essentially the same thing, but there's some different tax ramifications. It trades a little differently. So exchange traded funds will change at end of market every day, immediately in the market. They trade more like individual stocks, whereas mutual funds only trade at the end of market close, which none of this is that important for you guys. But the one important thing that's a difference between the exchange traded fund and the mutual fund is the initial investment limits. So for mutual funds, they tend to have these initial investment limits where you have to put in $2,500 or $3,000 to even buy in, essentially. It's, I think, $3,000 for most Vanguard funds and $2,500 for most Fidelity funds. After that, you can buy small amounts, but exchange traded funds, you can get in and buy a single share of that exchange traded fund at whatever the market cost is. So that can vary. It can vary from, $25 to, $300 per share, but you can get in at a much lower cost. So you may want to do that if you don't have $2,500 to get started. So I talked to you about these things because I think, it's life success in addition to college success. And I want you to feel like you have some safety in terms of your retirement, in addition to your day-to-day expenses and managing that for your time as a student with your budget and not buying things that you can't afford and making sure you don't get into debt. So hopefully all of you will be healthy, wealthy, and wise with the information that I've given.